April 15th, 1943. 23,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley. The sky is cold and blue, sliced by contrails. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses drones eastward, their aluminum bodies glinting in the thin sunlight. Below them, the industrial heart of Nazi Germany pumps smoke into the morning haze. Then, from the southeast, they come. Bf-109s, FW-190s, black crosses on silver wings. The Luftwaffe fighters climb with predatory confidence, rolling into attack formation. Their pilots have done this before. They know the bombers are alone now. The escorts, P-38s, Spitfires, have turned back. Fuel exhausted, range spent. But today, something is different. High above the bomber stream, a new silhouette appears. Bulky, blunt-nosed, almost comically large for a fighter. The German pilots see them and smirk beneath their oxygen masks. Another Allied experiment, another easy kill. They have no idea what's about to happen. By the spring of 1943, the Allied strategic bombing campaign over Europe was bleeding to death. Every day, American B-17s and B-24s crossed the Channel, penetrating deeper into the Reich. Their mission was clear: destroy German industry, cripple the war machine, break the enemy's will. But the reality was brutal. Without fighter escort, the bombers were sitting ducks. Luftwaffe interceptors tore through formations with impunity, sending fortresses and liberators spinning toward the earth in flames. The losses were catastrophic. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a double raid against Schweinfurt and Regensburg. 60 bombers were lost in a single day. 600 men. The numbers didn't lie. Unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. The problem was simple: range. British Spitfires were magnificent dogfighters, but their fuel tanks ran dry over the French coast. The twin-engined P-38 Lightning could reach farther, but engine reliability plagued it in the cold European skies, and its performance at high altitude was inconsistent. The early P-51A Mustangs, fitted with Allison engines, lacked the power to fight effectively above 20,000 feet, where the bombers flew and the Luftwaffe hunted. The bombers needed a guardian angel that could climb high, fly far, and fight hard. They needed a machine that could survive the gauntlet of German flak and fighters, take punishment, and still bring its pilot home. Enter the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. But when it first arrived in England in late 1942, nobody believed it was the answer. It was too big, too heavy, 7 tons with a full fuel load, twice the weight of a Spitfire. Pilots fresh from training looked at it and saw a flying tank, not a fighter. Ground crews nicknamed it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. Others called it worse. Even General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Air Forces, expressed doubts. He wanted sleek interceptors, not aerial battering rams. The P-47 seemed like a design mistake, a brute force answer to a problem that required finesse. The Luftwaffe agreed. German intelligence tracked the arrival of the first P-47 units in England. Pilots studied reconnaissance photos and laughed. The Americans had built a fighter that looked like a barrel with wings. It would never turn with a 109. It would never climb with a 190. In the crucible of air combat, where speed and agility meant life or death, the Thunderbolt looked like a joke. But Republic Aviation hadn't built a joke. They'd built a weapon. The company's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, understood something that many tacticians didn't. Altitude was everything. The war over Europe was being fought in the thin, frozen air above 20,000 feet. At that altitude, engine power collapsed, maneuverability diminished. Only one thing mattered: raw, sustained horsepower. Kartveli wrapped his fighter around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial beast producing 2,000 horsepower. To make that power usable at altitude, he added a massive turbocharger buried in the belly of the fuselage, forcing compressed air into the engine, even in the stratosphere. The result was a machine that didn't just survive at high altitude, it thrived there. But power meant nothing without the ability to deliver violence, and in that regard, the Thunderbolt was about to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare.
The armament of the P-47 was unprecedented. 8 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each gun fed by a belt of 425 rounds, armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer. When a Thunderbolt pilot squeezed the trigger, he unleashed a combined rate of fire exceeding 100 rounds per second. The sound alone was apocalyptic, a tearing roar that could be heard over the scream of the engine. The .50 caliber round was a proven killer, heavy enough to penetrate armor, fast enough to reach out across 1,000 yards, devastating enough to shred control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, and rip through cockpits. American pilots had used the gun effectively on the P-38 and P-40, but never in this volume, never with this density of fire. The Thunderbolt didn't pepper its targets, it obliterated them. Compared to contemporary fighters, the P-47 was an outlier. The Spitfire Mark V carried 2 20mm cannons and 4 .33 machine guns, lethal in a snapshot, but limited by ammunition. The Bf-109G carried 1 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns, powerful but prone to jamming and requiring precise aim. The FW-190A had 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.92 guns, an excellent package, but still reliant on brief firing windows. The P-47 could hold the trigger down for 15 seconds of continuous fire. That was enough to saw a fighter in half. But firepower meant nothing if the plane couldn't reach the fight. And in early 1943, that was still an open question. The first P-47 unit to reach England was the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Hubert Zemke. They arrived in January 1943, full of confidence and eager to prove themselves. But their early missions were frustrating. The P-47's range, even with a belly tank, was limited to around 375 miles. That barely got them to the German border. Deep penetration missions, the ones where the bombers needed help most, were still out of reach. The Luftwaffe noticed, and they adapted. German controllers learned to track the American escorts. They waited until the P-47s turned back, fuel gauges dipping into the red, and then they pounced. The bombers, alone again, paid the price. The Americans needed more range. Engineers worked frantically to develop larger drop tanks, first 75 gallons, then 108, eventually 150. Pilots learned to nurse their fuel, leaning the mixture, throttling back during the cruise. Every gallon mattered. Every minute of loiter time over Germany was bought with sweat and calculation. But even as the logistical problems were being solved, another issue loomed larger: tactics. The P-47 couldn't dogfight like a Spitfire.
It couldn't outturn a 109 or outclimb a Focke-Wulf from a standing start. Pilots who tried to fight the old way, turning, twisting, trading shots in a horizontal knife fight, found themselves at a disadvantage. The jug was heavy. It rolled slowly. It bled energy in tight turns. German pilots exploited this ruthlessly. Focke-Wulf pilots would lure Thunderbolts into turning engagements, then slice away and reset for another pass. Bf-109 pilots climbed above them and dove through, relying on superior rate of climb to disengage at will. The learning curve was steep, and it was written in blood. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, one of the 56th's rising aces, nearly died learning the lesson. On June 26, 1943, his P-47 was jumped by Focke-Wulfs over France. He tried to turn with them. Mistake. Cannon shells ripped through his fuselage, shredding hydraulics, puncturing the cockpit. He barely made it home, the Thunderbolt so riddled with holes it was a miracle it flew at all. But Johnson survived, and he learned. The P-47 wasn't a dogfighter. It was a killer from above. Its strength wasn't agility. It was speed in the dive and stability in the roll. At high altitude, the Thunderbolt could dive like a meteor, reaching speeds that no German fighter could match. And once it reached those speeds, it could pull out, climb back up on the momentum, and reset for another pass. Boom and zoom, energy fighting, vertical tactics. This was the Thunderbolt's domain, and the pilots who mastered it became the deadliest fighter pilots in the European theater. But understanding a weapon and wielding it effectively are two different things, and the path from mockery to mastery would be written in fire and fear across the skies of Europe.
Lieutenant Francis Gabreski climbed into the cockpit of his P-47 for the first time and felt like he was entering an armored car. The cockpit was spacious, almost luxurious compared to the cramped confines of the P-40 Warhawk he'd trained in. But spacious meant heavy. The control stick felt stiff. The rudder pedals required real leg strength. Rolling into a turn wasn't intuitive. It was work. Gabreski taxied out for his first flight, applied power, and watched the runway disappear beneath him far too slowly. The Thunderbolt didn't leap into the air, it lumbered. It clawed for altitude with brute force rather than grace. In the air, his doubts deepened. The plane felt sluggish. It didn't respond crisply to control inputs. Compared to the nimble fighters he'd heard about, the Spitfire's ballet-like agility, or the 109's razor-sharp roll rate, the P-47 felt like a truck. He wasn't alone in his skepticism. Across the 56th, 78th, and 4th fighter groups, pilots grumbled. They'd been promised a war-winning fighter. Instead, they got a 7-ton anvil with wings. But then they took it above 20,000 feet. That's where the Thunderbolt came alive. The turbochargers spooled up, force-feeding the engine. Power didn't fade, it surged. The controls, mushy at low altitude, tightened. The climb rate, disappointing on takeoff, became ferocious. Suddenly, the P-47 wasn't sluggish, it was relentless. Gabreski pushed the nose down in a dive and watched the airspeed indicator wind past 400 miles per hour, 420, 450. The plane didn't buffet, it didn't shake. It flew straight and true, rock solid, eating altitude like a falling stone. He pulled back on the stick and felt the G-forces crush him into his seat. The Thunderbolt pulled out cleanly, bleeding speed, but gaining altitude. He was 5,000 feet higher than where he started the dive. Untouchable. This wasn't a dogfighter. This was a predator. Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, first encountered the P-47 over the Netherlands in April 1943. He was leading a Staffel of Bf-109Gs tasked with intercepting a bomber formation. As they climbed through 20,200 feet, someone called out contacts high into the west. Meyer squinted through his gun sight and saw them, big, fat American fighters lumbering along above the bombers. He smiled. Fresh meat. German pilots had been feasting on Allied fighters for months. The P-38s were clumsy at altitude, their Allison engines coughing in the cold. The early Spitfires had range limitations and were often forced to disengage just as the fight began. These new American planes looked even worse, heavy, ungainly, clearly overweight. Meyer ordered the attack. His 109 climbed aggressively, the Daimler-Benz engine howling. He expected the American pilots to panic, to break formation, to give him an easy deflection shot. Instead, the lead P-47 rolled inverted and dove. Not away, through. The Thunderbolt came down like a hammer, far faster than Meyer anticipated. He tried to follow, pushing his stick forward, but the P-47 was already gone, a shrinking dot pulling away at a speed his 109 couldn't match. Confused, Meyer reset and climbed again. The American was climbing too, regaining altitude with alarming efficiency. Meyer tried another pass. Same result. The P-47 dove, accelerated to impossible speed, and escaped before he could get his guns on target. Frustrated, Meyer broke off. The engagement had been a draw, but it left him uneasy. These new American fighters didn't fight like anything he'd seen before. Back on the ground, he filed his report. The new American fighter was fast in a dive, heavily armed, durable. But it couldn't turn. It couldn't dogfight. Exploit its weaknesses, he advised. Force it into a turning fight. It was sound advice, but it assumed the Americans would cooperate. They wouldn't. Alexander Kartveli never apologized for the P-47's weight. When critics pointed out that the Thunderbolt was nearly twice as heavy as a Spitfire, he shrugged. Weight, he argued, was survivability, and survivability was everything. Kartveli had designed the P-47 around a single principle: bring the pilot home. To achieve that, he built the plane like a tank. The fuselage was thick, constructed from heavy-gauge aluminum. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plate, behind the seat, beneath the floor, around the engine. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that swelled and plugged bullet holes. The radial engine itself was a defensive asset. Unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines used in the 109 and Mustang, the R-2800 didn't rely on a vulnerable coolant system. A single bullet through a coolant line could kill an inline engine in minutes. But the radial could absorb damage, cylinders could be shot away, and the engine would keep running on the rest. Kartveli also designed redundancy into every system: dual ignition, multiple hydraulic lines, backup controls. The P-47 could take horrific damage and still fly. And it did. Pilots returned from missions with Thunderbolts that looked like flying scrap heaps, wings shredded by cannon fire, tails perforated, fuselages riddled with holes. Planes that should have fallen from the sky kept flying, kept fighting, kept bringing their pilots home. Republic's engineers had gambled that survivability and firepower would outweigh agility. In the unforgiving crucible of high-altitude combat over Europe, that gamble paid off. But engineering brilliance meant nothing without tactical evolution, and across the fighter groups of the 8th Air Force, a revolution in thinking was about to take hold.
Colonel Hubert Zemke didn't believe in sacred cows. As commander of the 56 Fighter Group, he watched his pilots struggle with the Thunderbolt's characteristics and made a decision. Stop trying to fight like Spitfires. Embrace what the P-47 actually was. He gathered his squadron leaders and laid it out plainly. The Thunderbolt's advantages were altitude performance, dive speed, firepower, and durability. Its weaknesses were rate of climb from low altitude and turning radius. Therefore, the tactics were obvious. Never get slow, never get low, and never turn when you can dive. Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly. Altitude discipline became religion. Stay high, always. If you see the enemy below, you have the advantage. If they're above, run. Don't climb to meet them, dive away and reset. Use the sun, use the clouds, use surprise. When you attack, commit fully. Dive fast, aim carefully,
Fire in short, controlled bursts. 8 guns meant overkill. You didn't need a long firing pass. 2 seconds on target was enough to destroy anything. After the attack, don't linger. Use your speed to extend, climb back to altitude, and reassess. Never, ever get sucked into a swirling dogfight at low altitude. Other groups adopted similar doctrines. The 4th Fighter Group, transferring from Spitfires to Thunderbolts, initially resisted the new tactics. They were used to turning fights, to close-in knife work, but combat losses forced them to adapt. Captain Don Gentile, one of the 4th's top aces, later admitted that the P-47 required a complete mental shift. He said, "You had to think three-dimensionally, not just left and right, but up and down. The vertical was your friend." The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was slow to adjust. German tactical doctrine still emphasized tight formations and turning engagements. They'd been successful with those tactics against Spitfires and early American fighters. But the P-47 didn't play that game. And slowly, the kill ratios began to shift. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun was not a precision instrument. It was a sledgehammer. Each round weighed approximately 1.7 ounces and left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The kinetic energy alone was devastating. When an armor-piercing incendiary round struck an aircraft, it didn't just puncture. It exploded on impact, spraying molten fragments through internal structure. A single hit could sever a control cable. 3 hits could destroy an aileron. A concentrated burst into an engine cowling could turn a Daimler-Benz or BMW radial into a block of shrapnel. But the real lethality came from volume. When a Thunderbolt pilot opened fire, 8 streams of 50 caliber rounds converged at a preset distance, usually 300 yards. At that convergence point, the cone of fire was roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything inside that cone was annihilated. Luftwaffe pilots who survived P-47 attacks described the experience in horrifying terms. The sound was unlike anything else, a roaring buzzsaw scream that lasted only seconds but felt eternal. The visual was worse. Tracers arcing in from above and behind, so dense that they looked like solid beams of light. Fighters hit by concentrated P-47 fire didn't catch fire and spiral down gracefully. They disintegrated. Wings folded, tails separated, cockpits exploded. Oberst Johannes Steinwurf, a Luftwaffe ace who flew throughout the war, later wrote that the P-47's firepower was psychologically terrifying. Even if you evaded the first pass, the knowledge that another could come at any moment was crushing. And the ammunition capacity meant Thunderbolt pilots could afford to fire longer bursts. They didn't need to be misers. They could walk their fire onto target, adjusting aim in real time, hosing down an enemy plane until it stopped being a threat. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe pilots were warned explicitly, "If you hear the American 8-gun fighter, brake immediately. Do not try to outturn it. Do not assume you can absorb the fire. Just run." The change didn't happen overnight. But by the autumn of 1943, something had fundamentally shifted in the skies over Europe. German fighter pilots, once supremely confident, began to exhibit caution. They no longer pressed attacks on bomber formations if Thunderbolts were present. They disengaged earlier. They avoided prolonged engagements. American intelligence officers noted the shift in interrogation reports. Captured Luftwaffe pilots, when asked about the P-47, spoke with grudging respect. Some called it the beast. Others admitted they'd been ordered to avoid it when possible. The mockery was gone. In its place was something more primal: fear. For the Americans, confidence soared. Pilots who'd once doubted the Thunderbolt now swore by it. They painted kill markings on their engine cowlings. They named their planes with pride, like Hairless Joe, Big Stud, and Penrod and Sam. Gabreski, Johnson, Zemke, these names became legends, and they all flew jugs. The psychological reversal was complete. The hunter had become the hunted. And nowhere would that reversal be more violently demonstrated than in the crucible of combat over the heart of the Reich itself. June 22, 1943. The sky above Antwerp. Captain Walter Mahoran, flying with the 56th Fighter Group's 63rd Squadron, spotted them first, a formation of FW-190s, 12 strong, climbing hard toward a box of B-17s. Mahoran keyed his radio. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Let's go." He rolled his P-47 inverted and pulled through, diving toward the German formation. His wingman followed, then the rest of the flight. 4 Thunderbolts plunging from 28,000 feet like stooping hawks. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400, 420, 450. The world compressed into a tunnel of speed and focus. Mahoran's hands were steady on the stick, his thumb hovering over the gun trigger. The Germans saw them coming too late. Mahoran selected the trailing FW-190, a single fighter lagging slightly behind the formation. He centered the illuminated gun sight reticle on the enemy's fuselage, waited until the range closed to 300 yards, and fired. 8 guns roared. The effect was instantaneous. Pieces flew off the 190's cowling. White smoke erupted from the engine. The fighter rolled hard left, trying to evade, but Mahoran stayed with it, holding the trigger down for a 3-second burst. The 190's canopy shattered. The plane snap-rolled and fell away, trailing fire. Mahoran didn't watch it die. He was already pulling out of the dive, bleeding speed, but climbing on pure momentum. Below him, the German formation had scattered, their attack broken before it began. His wingman called out a kill. Another P-47 from the flight had nailed a second 190. The remaining Germans fled west, diving for the deck, abandoning the bombers entirely. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. No American losses, 2 confirmed kills. It was textbook energy fighting, and it was becoming the norm. That same month, Lieutenant Robert C. Johnson, still flying despite the near-fatal damage his plane had absorbed, was proving the Thunderbolt's durability in the most dramatic way possible. On June 26th, over Évreux, France, Johnson's flight was bounced by FW-190s. The Germans had altitude advantage and attacked with vicious precision. Johnson's P-47 took a 20mm cannon shell through the right wing root, then another through the cockpit. The canopy exploded. Shards of plexiglass tore into his face. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the instrument panel. The control stick went sloppy, cables severed or damaged. Johnson could barely see through the blood running into his eyes. He pushed the stick forward and dove. The 190 that had hit him followed, hungry for the kill. Johnson's engine was still running, miracle number 1. His controls still responded, barely, miracle number 2. The 190 pilot closed in, firing short bursts, walking his rounds across the Thunderbolt's fuselage. Johnson could hear the impacts, metallic thumps and crashes as shells tore through aluminum. His left aileron shredded, his rudder was shot to ribbons, but the P-47 kept flying. Johnson hailed back on the stick, trading speed for altitude, then shoved forward again, jinking as best he could. The German pilot, frustrated, pressed closer. too close. Johnson snap-rolled right, an instinctive maneuver, not planned, and the FW-190 overshot, flashing past his canopy so near that Johnson could see the pilot's face. Then the German made a mistake. Instead of climbing away and resetting, he tried to loop back for another attack, but his speed was too low. The loop tightened, his energy bled out. Johnson's plane might have been dying, but the R-2800 engine was still delivering power. He pulled up beneath the 190, centered his gun sight, and fired. The burst was short. Half his guns were jammed, but enough. The 190 staggered, rolled inverted, and fell. Johnson limped home. The P-47 landed gear up, skidding across the runway in a shower of sparks. When the ground crew counted the damage, they found over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes in the frame. The plane was a total write-off. But Johnson walked away. The story spread through the fighter groups like wildfire. If a plane could take that kind of punishment and still bring its pilot home, then maybe, just maybe, the odds weren't as bad as they seemed. But individual heroism was only part of the equation. The real turning point came when the Thunderbolts began operating not as scattered flight.
June 22, 1943. The sky above Antwerp. Captain Walter Mahoran, flying with the 56th Fighter Group's 63rd Squadron, spotted them first, a formation of FW-190s, 12 strong, climbing hard toward a box of B-17s. Mahoran keyed his radio. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Let's go." He rolled his P-47 inverted and pulled through, diving toward the German formation. His wingman followed, then the rest of the flight. 4 Thunderbolts, plunging from 28,000 feet like stooping hawks. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400, 420, 450. The world compressed into a tunnel of speed and focus. Mahoran's hands were steady on the stick, his thumb hovering over the gun trigger. The Germans saw them coming too late. Mahoran selected the trailing FW-190, a single fighter lagging slightly behind the formation. He centered the illuminated gun sight reticle on the enemy's fuselage, waited until the range closed to 300 yards, and fired. 8 guns roared. The effect was instantaneous. Pieces flew off the 190's cowling. White smoke erupted from the engine. The fighter rolled hard left, trying to evade, but Mahoran stayed with it, holding the trigger down for a 3-second burst. The 190's canopy shattered. The plane snap-rolled and fell away, trailing fire. Mahoran didn't watch it die. He was already pulling out of the dive, bleeding speed but climbing on pure momentum. Below him, the German formation had scattered, their attack broken before it began. His wingman called out a kill. Another P-47 from the flight had nailed a second 190. The remaining Germans fled west, diving for the deck, abandoning the bombers entirely. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. No American losses. 2 confirmed kills. It was textbook energy fighting, and it was becoming the norm. That same month, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, still flying despite the near-fatal damage his plane had absorbed, was proving the Thunderbolt's durability in the most dramatic way possible. On June 26th, over Évry, France, Johnson's flight was bounced by FW-190s. The Germans had altitude advantage and attacked with vicious precision. Johnson's P-47 took a 20mm cannon shell through the right wing root, then another through the cockpit. The canopy exploded. Shards of plexiglass tore into his face. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the instrument panel. The control stick went sloppy. Cables severed or damaged. Johnson could barely see through the blood running into his eyes. He pushed the stick forward and dove. The FW-190 that had hit him followed, hungry for the kill.
The engine was still running, miracle number 1. His controls still responded, barely, miracle number 2. The German pilot closed in, firing short bursts, walking his rounds across the Thunderbolt's fuselage. Johnson could hear the impacts, metallic thumps and crashes as shells tore through aluminum. His left aileron shredded. His rudder was shot into ribbons. But the 47 kept flying. Johnson hauled back on the stick, trading speed for altitude, then shoved forward again, jinking as best he could. The German pilot, frustrated, pressed closer, too close. Johnson snap-rolled right, an instinctive maneuver, not planned, and the FW-190 overshot, flashing past his canopy so near that Johnson could see the pilot's face. Then the German made a mistake. Instead of climbing away and resetting, he tried to loop back for another attack, but his speed was too low. The loop tightened. His energy bled out. Johnson's plane might have been dying, but the R-2800 engine was still delivering power. He pulled up beneath the 190, centered his gun sight, and fired. The burst was short, half his guns were jammed, but enough. The 190 staggered, rolled inverted, and fell. Johnson limped home. The P-47 landed gear up, skidding across the runway in a shower of sparks. When the ground crew counted the damage, they found over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes in the airframe. The plane was a total write-off. But Johnson walked away. The story spread through the fighter groups like wildfire. If a plane could take that kind of punishment and still bring its pilot home, then maybe, just maybe, the odds weren't as bad as they seemed. But individual heroism was only part of the equation. The real turning point came when the Thunderbolts began operating not as scattered flights, but as a coordinated armada of destruction. By the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force had learned to deploy their Thunderbolts with brutal efficiency. The key was numbers and coordination. Instead of single squadrons escorting bomber formations, entire fighter groups, 48 to 60 P-47s, swarmed over the bombers like protective wolves. They flew in layered formations, high cover at 30,000 feet, middle cover at 25, close escort at 22. When German fighters appeared, the high cover dove, the middle cover blocked escape routes. The close escort stayed with the bombers, shooting down anything that penetrated the screen. The Luftwaffe couldn't adapt fast enough. Their tactics, perfected against smaller, more fragile escorts, were suddenly obsolete. Trying to attack a bomber box protected by 60 Thunderbolts was suicidal. The numbers bore this out. In July 1943, bomber losses per mission averaged 4.2%. By October, that number had dropped to 2.8%. The Thunderbolts weren't just escorting, they were dominating. And then came Big Week. February 20th to 25th, 1944. Operation Argument. The goal? Destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter production capacity by launching coordinated, massive raids on German aircraft factories. The 8th Air Force threw everything it had at the Reich. Over 3,000 bomber sorties, escorted by waves of P-47s, P-38s, and the newly arrived long-range P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them. This was their homeland, their factories, their future. They fought with desperate fury. The sky over Germany became a killing ground. On February 22nd, over Oscherleben, the 56th Fighter Group encountered the largest concentration of German fighters they'd ever seen. Over 70 Bf-109s and FW-190s, stacked in layers, attacking the bomber stream from every angle. Colonel Zemke led the counterattack personally. His Thunderbolts tore into the German formations, firing in long, murderous bursts. The sky filled with smoke and debris. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the gray winter clouds. When the day's tally was counted, the 56th had claimed 18 confirmed kills. Gabreski alone got 3. The bombers, though battered, made it through. The pattern repeated over the next 4 days. Furious air battles, staggering losses on both sides. But the bombers kept coming. The Thunderbolts kept killing. The factories burned. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 fighters, not just planes, but pilots, experienced aces, squadron leaders, men who couldn't be replaced. American losses were heavy too, but the Americans could replace their losses. The Germans couldn't. The balance of air power had shifted permanently. Major Heinz Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's top-scoring aces with over 200 kills, flew throughout Big Week. In his post-war memoirs, he described the experience as apocalyptic. He wrote, "The Americans came in such numbers that we could not shoot them all down. Even when we broke through the fighters and reached the bombers, more fighters appeared. The P-47s especially, they were everywhere. Heavy, yes, but fast and brutal. And they had fuel. They could stay and fight. We could not." Baer survived the war. Many of his comrades did not. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week was the beginning of the end. The attrition was unsustainable. Pilot training was shortened. Quality declined. Fuel shortages worsened. The death spiral had begun. For the 8th Air Force, Big Week was vindication. The strategic bombing campaign, once on the brink of collapse, was now winning. And the P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane that had been mocked and doubted, was one of the primary instruments of victory. The laughter had stopped. But the cost of that victory, and the ripples it sent through the rest of the war, were only beginning to be understood.
April 1943 to May 1945. P-47 Thunderbolts flew 546,000 combat sorties in the European theater of operations. They claimed 3,752 air-to-air kills, more than any other American fighter type in Europe. Their loss rate in air combat was one of the lowest of the war. But numbers alone didn't capture the shift. What mattered was the psychological and strategic impact. By early 1944, Luftwaffe fighter pilots dreaded encountering P-47s. Intelligence reports, intercepted by Allied codebreakers, revealed German fighter controllers explicitly warning their pilots to avoid engagement with heavy American single-engine fighters unless absolutely necessary. Oberst Günter Rahl, third highest-scoring ace of the war, later admitted in interviews that the arrival of the P-47 in significant numbers changed everything. "We could no longer fight on our terms," he said. "We had to react, to defend, to survive. The initiative was gone." The bomber crews noticed too. Before mid-1943, returning from a mission over Germany was a matter of luck. After mid-1943, it was expected. Tail gunners, who'd spent months firing desperately at attacking fighters, began to relax when they saw the distinctive silhouette of a jug weaving overhead. Letters home from bomber crewmen praised the fighter pilots with almost religious fervor. "They saved us," one waist gunner wrote to his family. "Every time we thought we were dead, the jugs came down and scattered them like sheep." The Thunderbolt's survivability became legendary. Pilots routinely brought home planes that looked like flying colanders, riddled with holes, missing pieces, leaking fluids, but still airworthy. Republic Aviation ran advertisements featuring photos of returning P-47s with captions like, "It can take it." The phrase became a motto. Ground crews stenciled it on engine cowlings. Pilots believed it with the fervor of converts, and they had reason to.
The P-47's loss rate from ground fire and mechanical failure was astonishingly low. Pilots who were shot down often survived. The plane's structural strength meant it could absorb catastrophic damage and still glide, still give the pilot a chance to bail out or crash land.
Robert S. Johnson flew his famous damaged P-47 home in June 1943. He went on to score 27 kills, becoming one of the top aces of the war. He never flew anything but Thunderbolts. Francis Gabreski, initially skeptical of the plane, ended the war with 28 kills in Europe, making him the top-scoring American ace in the ETO still alive at war's end. He later said the P-47 was the best fighter plane ever built. The Germans, meanwhile, scrambled to respond. They tried heavier armament, 30-millimeter cannons, air-to-air rockets. They experimented with tactics, frontal attacks, hit-and-run dives, night interception. Nothing worked consistently. The brutal truth was that the Luftwaffe was fighting an attrition war it couldn't win. Every loss was harder to replace. Every veteran shot down was a hole that couldn't be filled. By mid-1944, many German fighter pilots were teenagers with less than 50 hours of flight time. They were thrown into combat against hardened American pilots, flying superior machines. The results were predictable. The Thunderbolt didn't win the air war alone. The P-51 Mustang, with its longer range, played a crucial role in escorting bombers deep into Germany. The P-38 Lightning performed admirably in certain theaters. Allied numerical superiority and industrial capacity were decisive factors. But the P-47 was the blunt instrument that broke the Luftwaffe's back. It was the plane that proved American engineering could match and surpass the best Europe had to offer. And it was the plane that turned the tide when the outcome was still in doubt. Yet the P-47's impact stretched far beyond the skies of Europe, reaching into other theaters and reshaping the very nature of air combat itself. The P-47 wasn't just a European success story. It excelled in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the China-Burma-India theater, often in roles its designers never anticipated. In the Pacific, the Thunderbolt arrived late but made an immediate impact. The 348th Fighter Group, equipped with P-48Ds, deployed to the Southwest Pacific in mid-1943. Initially, pilots were skeptical. The plane seemed ill-suited to the long overwater flights and jungle airstrips of the region. But the P-47 proved adaptable. Its ruggedness was perfect for rough field operations. Its firepower annihilated Japanese fighters, which were lightly built and vulnerable. And its ability to carry bombs and rockets made it a devastating ground attack platform. By 1944, Thunderbolts were hammering Japanese positions across New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa. They destroyed aircraft on the ground, shredded supply convoys, and provided close air support for advancing infantry. Pilots discovered that the P-47 could carry up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance, more than many dedicated bombers. In Europe, the same transformation occurred.
As Allied forces pushed into France after D-Day, Thunderbolts transitioned from high-altitude escort to low-level ground attack. They hunted tanks, trains, trucks, and troop columns. They obliterated German supply lines. The P-47's 850 caliber guns, devastating against aircraft, were equally lethal against ground targets. A strafing pass from a Thunderbolt could shred a locomotive, destroy a convoy, or suppress an entire enemy position. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of the Jug's engine, a deep, grumbling growl that signaled incoming death. They called it Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. When Allied ground forces advanced, Thunderbolts flew ahead, clearing the path. By war end, P-47s had destroyed more ground targets than any other Allied fighter. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of trains, countless fortifications, all obliterated by the plane that was supposed to be just a fighter. The legacy of the Thunderbolt extended into the post-war years. Republic Aviation produced over 15,600 P-47s in multiple variants, more than any other American fighter except the P-51 Mustang. The plane served in the air forces of over a dozen nations, including Brazil, Mexico, France, and China. It influenced fighter design philosophy for decades. The emphasis on durability, firepower, and high-altitude performance became standard. Future jets like the Republic F-84 Thunderjet and F-105 Thunder Chief carried the Thunderbolt's DNA: heavy, tough, hard-hitting. The pilots who flew the P-47 went on to shape post-war military aviation. Zemke, Gabreski, Johnson, these men became instructors, test pilots, and leaders. They passed down the lessons learned in the crucible of combat over Europe. And the plane itself became a symbol, not of grace or elegance, but of power, of endurance, of the principle that sometimes brute force applied intelligently is the answer. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't the prettiest fighter of World War II. It wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable, but it was one of the most effective. It did its job, brought its pilots home, and changed the outcome of the war. The Germans laughed at it once. They learned not to. And in the silence that followed the guns, a deeper truth emerged about what the Thunderbolt represented, not just as a machine, but as a testament to human ingenuity and the price of underestimation.
The P-47 Thunderbolt was never supposed to be graceful. It was supposed to survive. In the desperate calculus of industrial warfare, where thousands of young men climbed into machines and faced death at 25,000 feet, elegance was a luxury. What mattered was coming home. What mattered was winning. The Germans underestimated the Jug because they judged it by the wrong metrics. They saw weight and assumed weakness. They saw size and assumed sluggishness. They looked at it and laughed. But the Thunderbolt embodied a different philosophy, one that prized resilience over refinement, firepower over finesse. It was built by engineers who understood that the war would be won not by the most beautiful machines, but by the most effective ones. And effectiveness, in the end, is measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. The young men who flew the P-47
American boys from farms and cities, barely out of their teens, learned to trust the plane with their lives. They learned that the heavy controls meant strength, that the roaring engine meant power, that the 8 guns meant dominance. They stopped seeing it as a flying tank and started seeing it as a guardian. Their guardian. On the other side, German pilots, many of them equally young, equally brave, learned a harder lesson. They learned that contempt is a poor substitute for respect, that assumptions can be fatal, that the machine they mocked was the instrument of their defeat. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just help win the air war over Europe, it redefined it. It proved that air superiority could be seized and held through attrition, through endurance, through the relentless application of overwhelming force. And when the war ended and the survivors returned home, they carried with them a truth forged in fire. Never underestimate the weapon your enemy brings to the fight, because sometimes the thing you laugh at becomes the thing you fear most. The Thunderbolt taught that lesson well, and the sky over Europe would never forget.
Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below, and press the bell icon. More incredible WW2 stories are on the way.